Travis Scott's album Utopia is a critical and commercial success. And what you'll find is that there's a beat formula that is used on many of this album's songs. So today we're going to talk about what this beat formula is. I'm also going to show you multiple sampling ideas along the way, drum pattern techniques, useful effects, and lots more. So let's get into it. Now, to make our lives easier, let's create a checklist for this formula. This is going to give me a general direction to head towards. So number one, I want to use samples. When looking at the credits on Utopia, you will notice that this album includes far more samples compared to his prior albums. So that is one thing that we will add onto this checklist. Number two, I want there to be a psychedelic element in this beat. A big part of what makes this album stand out was the use of psychedelic ideas within the production. And finally, number three, I want to take everything and put it into a trap structure. I'm going to take all of the ideas that I create within this beat and structure them using trappier sounds. So this is the checklist that I will follow when trying to make decisions for this beat. So let's start with number one and look for a good sample. Many people always tell me that they struggle to find samples. Personally, I think you can find great samples all over YouTube. For example, I recently found this YouTube channel here, Vinyl Archaeology, that has a ton of great samples. So let's look on this page for a sample that we can use. Cool, soulful sample here, but not what I'm looking for. Really nice sample here, but I'm not looking to make a flute type beat right now. So I think this might work for what I want. And the reason has to do with the instrumentation. Again, when we look at our checklist, number two is a psychedelic element within the beat. And this sample has some nice guitar sounds in it that we can easily make psychedelic, which is why I feel like this sample will be a better fit for this idea. Let's bring this into my sampler, and now we can cross this off the list. We now have our sample. All right, so let's start building our beat. Like I mentioned, these guitars here are what I want to focus on, but already we have a problem. These guitars are a small texture and they're surrounded by a lot of other sounds within the sample. So to start, let's do our best to isolate them. One thing that you'll notice is that the guitars are predominantly on the right channel. I'll play this again. So what I can do is try removing the entire left channel so that all that's left is the right side. Let's hear how the sample sounds when I try to do that. The guitars now sound much cleaner. Next, let's build a loop using this sample. I've already placed my chops around these guitar notes within the sample, so let's find a musical phrase or an idea using these chops. Alright, this simple idea here sounds like a good enough place to start. Now let's move on to the second part of this formula, which is to include a psychedelic element. To do this, I'm going to use some sound altering effects on this guitar sample to make it feel more psychedelic. One great effect to achieve this is chorus. Here I'm using Super VHS, but I'm more interested in the magic button here, which I believe you can just download for free. It's a great chorus tool if you want something drastic like this. And I'll also use Guitar Rig and add this onto the sample as well. Here I'm using a delay preset. This is to help the sound take up more space and feel bigger in the beat overall. From here, I'll do some slight EQing to contain what space this layer sits in. And just like that, we have our psychedelic element within our beat. So we can check off number two on this list. Now I do want to create more within this beat. I don't think this one single layer will be enough to make this beat feel unique, so let's build some more before we move on to structuring this beat. Now to build more, I definitely could look in my plugins and VSTs, but first I'm going to clone the same sample out and see if I can find another sound in here that I can layer with my current sound. This is just a quick check that I like to do to find a texture that will easily fit with my current layer, since they both come from the same source, and therefore more likely they'll fit with one another. Nothing here or there. This piano here actually sounds pretty clean. It's just a singular note and it doesn't have much around it in terms of other instrumentation, so I should be able to isolate this and use it as an instrument. If I just use piano mode and do some slight EQing, now I can play this like it was any other regular sound and use it to build a pattern. Now, I have said this before, I don't know music theory, but luckily you don't need it to make beats. I have my own step-by-step process I like to use. So first, let me figure out what notes sound good with my current sample. To do this, I'm just gonna go through all 12 notes and listen to see which ones sound like they fit as my loop is playing. Alright, there were a few that sounded pretty good. I'm gonna remember them or note them down, and I'll use them to create a pattern. So let's just start with a basic framework. No need to build a masterpiece right away. But I do want to add more detail into this pattern and make it feel more robust instead of a simple melody line. So I'm going to take this same C note here and play it at an octave lower and see how that sounds. Not really much of a difference here, so I'll add one more note underneath from my list of notes that sounded good to me before. Alright, this feels like a more substantial change. So I'll place a note in a similar range for the next beat here for this pattern. And same thing again for the next beat. Alright, so this sounds good to me so far. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that for the most part, I built this more complex part of my pattern during the section of my loop where less is happening. Let me show you what I mean. In my sample, this chop here has 2 guitar notes playing in a short span of time, but this longer chop here is just one single note, so there isn't much going on during this section of my loop. Hence me playing a lot more of my notes during this section. Now I will say I may need to make some adjustments to this pattern later on. Once I structure out my beat and I add my drums and the rest of the sounds, it might feel like I've built something that's way too busy and I might need to reduce this pattern. But for now, I'm just focused on building during this phase of the beat making process, so I'll worry about that later. Now instead of merely just copying and pasting this pattern for the second bar, I'm going to create something a little bit more robust. Meaning I will create a slightly different pattern for bar 2 as a way to keep this beat from sounding repetitive. This is sounding good. I do want to quickly check how these higher notes sound though. I really like the way these higher notes sound. They're almost bellish, so I'm going to add a few notes up here in my pattern. Alright, I feel like this loop is a lot more full compared to how this sounded without these twinkling piano notes. By the way, if you find these beat making frameworks and processes helpful and you want to figure out how to apply them into your beats, think about applying it to my producer program, Better Beatmaker. I'm opening up new spots really soon. It's basically for newer producers who want more hands-on help rather than relying on passive videos like this. So if you're looking for a way to accelerate your progress, you can find the link in the description box below. Anyways, back to the video. Now let's move on to the last part of our checklist, which is to put this into a trap structure. So let's start by bringing in an 808 that's super distorted and over the top, much like the ones that appear in this album. So this is what I'm going to use. To get this to sound this distorted, I use Decapitator, which is often my go-to if I want to beef up my drums or my bass. And now I'm just going to create a simple pattern. Now there's a few things that I want to point out with this pattern. Even though it might look like there's a lot going on, it really isn't. Essentially, this pattern is a simple 3-step progression. But I decided to shorten these notes, and the reason why is because the beat already felt pretty full with my guitar pattern. You can see the guitar has quite a bit of presence in the lower mid frequencies even after I used my original EQ to reduce this area. And my 808 also has a lot of presence in the same lower mid frequency range. So I think it's going to be a good idea to shorten the length of these notes and therefore reduce the presence of this 808 overall. But there's something else I am doing with this pattern, which is that I'm creating bends right before the note cuts off. This is just purely a stylistic choice that I like. Now let's bring in our drums. Here I will place a snare on the 2 and the 4. A simple pattern here, and the same idea with the kick pattern as well. I'll create something simple. One thing to point out, for the most part, these kicks aren't adding anything new into my beat. You'll notice that mostly every kick plays at the exact same time as some other instrument is also playing within my loop. I'm doing this because I feel like my beat already has a lot of complex patterns, especially my piano pattern. So there's no need to go over the top and create some complex kick pattern here because that might overwhelm my beat and make it feel way too overcrowded. And I'll have the exact same approach with my hi-hat pattern. Most of these notes are playing at the exact same time as other sounds in my beat. I did also include some traditional trap ideas like a stutter and the hi-hats being played at multiple pitches. Again, this is me building that trap structuring here. Which, by the way, it looks like we have checked off. Our formula is complete, which is good, but I still think there's more work that needs to be done. I could stop here and move on to arranging, but I want to keep building more into this beat, almost to the point where it feels like there's too much going on, and then the name of the game becomes removing and minimizing the beat. This is the idea of subtractive arrangement, which I've talked about before. So I'm going to go ahead and include a couple more hi-hat patterns into this beat. As well as this perk stutter. I'm also gonna include this weird layer here. The way that I built this was I basically threw halftime on my main guitar loop and printed the entire sound out to create this. And then I isolated this one single note at the end and used it like a musical instrument. Again, just another way to take my already existing sample or idea within my beat and repurposing it to do more and add more into my production. Now there's one more sound I'm going to add into my beat, which is this sample here. I know this sounds awful, like it doesn't fit, but this is what effects are for. I'm going to try my best to make this feel more psychedelic to further reinforce that aesthetic in my beat using this sound. So I will start by trying to use Guitar Rig. To find this, I basically went into the guitar presets since I know that these presets will make this sound feel more guitarish and possibly psychedelic-ish. And I'll also use the exact same chorus tool that I used before. But this time, the more important part is this drift dial right here. This creates that bending effect that also seems to be common in many Travis Scott beats. And now I will use this to create yet another pattern within my beat. As you can hear, this feels like a lot. Definitely too much for a verse section for a beat. So I'm going to clone this pattern out and create some alternative patterns from this one, but basically minimize them so there's more room for rapping. So here is one alternative version that I'll use for the verse. One major difference between this pattern and the original is that I minimized this piano pattern quite a bit and deleted many of the additional notes. And for the sake of creating even more variation, I will create a second clone of this pattern for the verse. This one is slightly different. The piano notes have reduced again, but I did keep those higher notes for this version of the pattern. But you'll also notice that I shifted the 808 pattern. So now it's not playing during this time when those higher notes are playing, and instead come in later during the less busy part of my beat. Again, this is to create a good sense of openness so I don't end up overwhelming the beat with too many patterns playing at the exact same time. And now finally, I will create a bridge pattern here. I wanted to drop the energy level for this bridge, so I got rid of a lot of the drums, and I switched that traditional upfront snare for this percussive one that feels really hollowed out. And I altered the sample as well, so it's playing a far more basic plain pattern. And I also reduced how much space the sample is taking up by turning down the delay during this pattern. And now I can arrange this into a full beat using these various pieces. But that is it for this beat. If you enjoyed it, hit like and subscribe. Once again, if you want help with your beats, apply to Better Beatmaker. And if you like this video, check out the one next to me where I do a deep dive deconstruction into many of the beats off of Utopia if you like that album. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.